Talk of Western separation arrived on the steps of the Alberta legislature. Hundreds gathered to advocate for independence, while Indigenous groups stood in opposition. CTV's Kathy Lee on the growing divide.
A referendum on whether Alberta should separate from Canada is one step closer today. The province's election agency has approved a citizen-led petition to gather signatures on the issue.
Part of Canada, but unfortunately it's been this way for so long. Nothing's going to change. And especially with Carnian, it's going to get a lot worse.
Midnight in Ottawa. The lights were still on inside the Langevin block when the alert hit every newsroom in the country. It wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a leak. It was a coordinated declaration from 4 provincial capitals that has detonated the foundations of the Canadian Federation. Alberta, Saskatchewan, way toward leaving Canada and pursuing statehood within the United States. No exploratory committee, no slow constitutional dialogue, a timetable. And just like that, the country was thrust onto a tectonic fault. The announcement that stopped Parliament. Inside the House of Commons in Ottawa, staffers describe a moment that felt less like politics and more like impact shock. Phones erupted, legal teams scrambled, senior cabinet ministers huddled in corridors scanning statements that read less like negotiation and more like a corporate exit memo. There was no sentimental language about shared history, no invocation of confederation, just procedural clarity and a promise. Within 12 to 18 months, citizens in the West would be asked directly whether they want to sever ties and align southward. The silence in Parliament wasn't strategic, it was stunned. For the first time in modern history, multiple provinces signaled coordinated withdrawal, not symbolic
federal policies.
We have been dominated by Eastern politicians and Eastern politics.
Protecting the land and the resources. When treaties were made, they were a sacred covenant between our people and the Crown, and they're not being honored today.
They seem to think that they can just do whatever they want.
Protest, but structural departure. Edmonton, the sound of a break. Hours earlier, outside the Alberta legislature in Edmonton, the atmosphere was electric but controlled. Supporters of the separatist push gathered beneath winter skies, waving provincial flags and chanting about autonomy, resources, and representation. Many framed it not as rebellion, but as reclamation. For years, resentment has simmered across the energy-rich West: pipeline cancellations, emissions caps, federal taxation formulas that critics argue siphon billions eastward. The feeling, voiced repeatedly, is that decisions affecting oil fields and farmland are made in distant urban corridors. And now, that grievance has hardened into strategy. A calculated pivot, not a protest. This was not a theatrical outburst. According to constitutional analysts, if provinces were to declare independence and receive international recognition, and if federal authority ceased to function on their territory, the situation could evolve into de facto sovereignty under international law. That is not a fringe conversation anymore. The Western Bloc's argument is blunt. Energy exports are Canada's economic backbone.
Continues to pitch ideas regarding U.S. expansion and redrawing the world map, among them making Canada the 51st state.
Alberta and Saskatchewan sit atop vast oil and gas reserves. British Columbia controls critical Pacific ports. Manitoba anchors key transport corridors. Together, they are not peripheral, they are structural. Behind closed doors, officials in these provinces have reportedly been running economic models comparing continued federal alignment with potential U.S. integration. The pitch is framed around security guarantees, expanded market access, and regulatory relief. This isn't ideology, they insist. It's arithmetic. The shadow from Washington. The timing is not accidental. In recent months, President Donald Trump reignited rhetoric about continental expansion, floating the concept of Canada as a 51st state. What once sounded like campaign spectacle now sits against a backdrop of aggressive U.S. foreign moves, including a controversial military operation in Venezuela that ended with the capture of President Nicolas Maduro and his transfer to New York to face federal charges. That operation shattered assumptions about sovereignty norms. Western Canadian leaders watched closely. The message they took was stark. Borders are durable only when backed by decisive power. Ottawa's legal counterstrike. The federal response came quickly but cautiously. Emergency sessions were convened, constitutional scholars were summoned, challenges were filed to clarify whether provincial referendums could legally compel separation. And Alberta proposed amendments to election laws, including changes under what is known as Bill 14, adjusted how citizen-led referendum questions can proceed. The threshold for petitions was recalibrated, and questions deemed unconstitutional may be ruled non-binding. But here's the problem Ottawa faces: legality and enforceability are not the same. If provinces begin acting autonomously in trade, resource management, and external discussions, federal authority risks becoming symbolic rather than operational, a badge without backup. Markets react before politicians do. By morning, the Canadian dollar had dipped. Not a crash, but enough to trigger analyst alerts. Energy stocks swung sharply. Freight companies quietly reviewed cross-border logistics. Some shipments slowed as compliance departments tried to anticipate regulatory chaos. Capital does not wait for constitutional clarity. It anticipates risk. Social media became a national therapy session. Fear, defiance, humor, fury, all colliding in real time. In Toronto and Montreal, demonstrators rallied under Canadian flags, chanting about unity. In parts of the West, the streets were noticeably calmer. That calm unsettled observers even more. The Indigenous question. First Nations leaders in Alberta and Saskatchewan immediately demanded clarification. Treaties were signed with the Crown, not with hypothetical new states or foreign governments. If borders shift, who honors those agreements? That question remains unanswered tonight. Divided public opinion. Recent polling suggests most Canadians reject the idea of joining the United States, yet within Alberta, a significant minority, and in some surveys nearly half, express openness to departure if economic conditions worsen. This is no longer a fringe slogan like Wexit. It has entered mainstream debate, and once an idea crosses that threshold, it rarely returns to obscurity. Washington's silence. Notably absent from today's drama, a clear statement from Washington. No celebratory invitation, no outright rejection, just quiet. In geopolitics, silence can signal disinterest or preparation. Sources indicate U.S. policy teams are reviewing economic, defense, and legal implications of any potential application from Canadian provinces. Nothing official, but no doors slammed shut either. For Ottawa, that ambiguity may be the most destabilizing factor of all. A nation at a crossroads. Canada now faces three plausible futures: fragmentation, a smaller federation forced to redefine itself after losing core energy provinces; reconciliation through crisis, a renegotiated federal compact granting expanded provincial autonomy; gradual realignment, a prolonged transition toward deeper continental integration under U.S. influence. None of them are simple. None of them are calm. What changed tonight wasn't just policy, it was psychology. The map of North America hasn't moved yet, but in the minds of millions, its borders feel less permanent than they did yesterday. And once a nation begins imagining its own division, the outcome is no longer theoretical. The question echoing through Parliament, through prairie town halls, and through living rooms across the country is painfully direct. Is this a bargaining tactic, or is Canada witnessing the first chapter of its own transformation?